Prag. Thank you so much for joining me. Everybody's dying to know, what is nuclear fusion?
Thank you for having me. So fusion is when particles come together to produce energy, exactly the opposite of fission, where you have particles splitting. Helion just approaches fusion in a very differentiated way. Super efficient, direct capture of charged particles. We do not use steam turbines. We're not capturing the heat to then turn it into steam to then move the turbines. We built 7 prototypes. We're on our final prototype today and are now racing towards commercial inflection.
You spoke a little bit about what fusion is, which is like the less scary, version of fission. And you talked a little bit about where you are in the milestone. Now, your timetable for bringing this first commercial power plant online is what I would describe an aggressive one in 2028.
That's right.
So how are you doing to hit that in-service date? And you talked about milestones. What are the other milestones that need to be hit to get there?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned, 7th and final prototype. I think the company has had a track record of relentless innovation. Each of those prototypes have broken multiple industry records. We have already broken ground in the state of Washington, in Malaga, Washington, received permits in record time, and so absolutely on track for first electrons on the grid in 2028. So fusion is no longer, something that always used to be the joke a couple of decades out. It's here and now. In the interim, we're going to continue to operate Polaris. We are starting to invest in supply chains. We're expanding our manufacturing footprint so that we can perpetuate and have commercial inflection, commercial scale in the very near distant future.
I ran our energy and commodities team before I was in the technology group, and the joke was that fusion was always going to be the next best thing.
Right.
That's your version of it. You were talking about supply chains, so maybe let's pause there for a second, because the supply chain around fusion must be a challenging one, as in it was non-existent. So tell me about some of the challenges that you all have faced in establishing a supply chain for a technology that wasn't there before, and what needs to happen going forward to support that.
So we are building the industrial base for fusion today. We raised our Series F last year, $425 million. And the primary deployment of those proceeds, Lynn, was towards expanding our manufacturing footprint. For capacitors, we just across the street have now opened a facility that internally we call a mega, where we're exponentially increasing a capacitor production by a factor of over 10 times, which will over the next couple of years be 60 times as we further look to advance our manufacturing capabilities. Most importantly, we're also investing in our suppliers. So whether it's semiconductor chips, whether it's all these specialized parts that you talked about, we're not waiting to start with our first commercial power plant and then invest. We're doing that today. The vision of our founders has been deployment of a gigawatt a day. Even back in 2014, when the AI boom wasn't there, the vision was always a gigawatt a day of deployment. And so we're putting in the foundation today so that we can move forward in the next couple of years.
Interesting. And sort of dovetailing with that is policy and regulation, right? Ensuring that there is the incentive there. Now, when Helion Energy was first founded, the core mission was very much rooted in climate change and fighting global warming emissions with clean energy resources like fusion. Can't say that's top of mind for the current administration in the United States, but the AI boom is. So how are you navigating the change in politics and instances on climate change?
Maybe I think the first thing that you touched on was regulation. I think that's something that we're pretty proud of, having invested in making and getting regulatory changes done years in advance. So today, we're not regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has split fusion from fission. We're regulated as a particle accelerator. We're governed by the State Department of Health in the state of Washington, just like they do with university laboratories. And the key reason for that is fusion doesn't have the side effects of fission. There's no meltdown risk. There's no long-lived radioactive waste. And so we're seeing that when we first applied for siting and for permits in Malaga, Washington, for our first commercial fusion power plant. I think to your point, the administration is really supportive. If you really think about what are the impediments towards AI, at least in the Western world, we always compare ourselves to China, and we talk about energy dominance of China. I think we need energy dominance here. And to me, fusion is that perfect stepping stone, that new source of power that will allow us to continue to make all the progresses that AI and all the promises that AI has.
Okay, so we need fusion. I said 2028 was aggressive, and yet it's still like 2 years out.
Right.
So what are we going to do if energy is the bottleneck for the AI boom in the next 2 years before your first power plant comes online? What fills the void?
So today you do have, the demand for energy has increased quite dramatically, and you are seeing that being fulfilled by coal and by natural gas. Mm-hmm. That's why it's even more of a strategic imperative for fusion to have that calling and move as quickly as possible. And that's what, at least at Helion, we are working towards. There is no new source of energy outside of fusion that we expect, beyond 2028 to meet the demands of the AI boom that's coming up. Which is why, which is why even the timelines that you call aggressive, they're required for us to be able to fulfill the promise that AI has.
Yeah, and the timeline. Not that this is your problem, but then what happens to all of the gas and coal-fired power generation that is coming online now, being revived in order to power the data centers for AI today when your power plant and all the other fusion power plants come online?
So with any hot tech technology, and we were talking about my prior company, it takes time for commercial scale and deployment. Our vision remains a gigawatt a day of deployment.
A day.
But manufacturing, supply chains will take a little bit longer. And in the interim, you'll have existing solutions that will continue to power the world.
Okay, that was a very diplomatic way of answering that question. Let's switch over to the funding environment.
Sure.
Because, fusion was a small business, relatively speaking, for VCs. But now you've raised hundreds of millions, as you mentioned, just last year. Congratulations.
Thank
you. You have some big name backers. We mentioned Altman, but there's also Peter Thiel, Dustin Moskovitz. You're valued at more than $5 billion now. How has the environment changed for the industry and Helion? And what is it like working with Peter Thiel and Sam Altman as investors?
So when we started, there was no AI boom. And clearly you're seeing the tailwinds of that. And we see that every day. It's just the imperative to get as much power required out there for data centers, for hyperscalers, for electrification of the grid, electrification of several other industries. And so we're clearly seeing the tailwinds coming from that. To your question on, what was the other question?
How has the funding environment changed?
Funding environment. I think investors recognize companies that have a track record of fast timelines, capital efficiency, and relentless execution. And that's what Helion has been known for. You mentioned about timelines. We are moving fairly quickly. Relentless execution. We're on a 7th and final prototype. Capital efficiency. The company raised about $1 billion to date, but the 7 machines have taken only a fraction of that cost to put that together. And we're seeing that side effect when the Series F round that you mentioned, we were looking to raise $325 million last year. We had to upsize the round twice. We had over $1 billion in firm commitments. And so we feel fairly privileged that investors recognize the hard work that my colleagues and the founders are putting in so that we can bring fusion to the world as quickly as possible.
And then there was my second question, which was, what is it like working with Peter Thiel and the likes of Sam Altman?
I think it is a privilege to be working. I'll give you both the company perspective and my perspective. I think what Sam, who's been our chairman of the board for over a decade at this point, has allowed is for the founders to dream a lot bigger, to move a lot faster from a timeline perspective. Clearly, he saw what the rest of the world is still catching up to when it came to AI. And so he's allowed us to move faster. He's enabled us to think and dream bigger. And I think that's something that we feel absolutely grateful for. Just personally working with him over the last 2 years since I've joined the company, I think there are 3 things that I've personally taken away. It's dream big, do not impose self-limits, and relentlessly execute. And if you have that trifecta, right, like that's where the magic happens. And that's personally something that I aspire for on a daily basis when I'm leading my teams, when we're leading the company to move forward towards the timelines that we promised to the world.
That was really interesting insight. He does seem like a relentless leader from the outside. Does he text you every day, like, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" Like, is he, are they as involved at Helion as investors, or are they mostly just leaving you to it?
I think Sam's really good at guiding. Our investors are really good at guiding, but they make themselves available. So if I text him, I usually do get a response back fairly quickly. I think he is one of our biggest champions. And so for that, we're super grateful for everything that, whether it's Mithril Capital, Peter Thiel's a vehicle, or whether it's Sam, Dustin, and others who, have allowed us to be where we are today.
So I could imagine that OpenAI is a big potential customer for Helion, and you have a deal with Microsoft. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that agreement and what you see as like the ideal customers going forward for Helion's energy.
So hyperscalers like OpenAI, other large compute users.
Are we calling OpenAI a hyperscaler now?
Would be perfect, or big users of compute would be perfect customers for us. I have no additional customer announcements other than what we've already made today. But Microsoft and Nucor are folks that we've already signed up with. The first of its kind PPA was signed with Microsoft in 2023. That's Orion. That's where the construction of the first commercial power plant has commenced. We're going to put that power to the grid. Constellation Energy is serving as the power broker there. And the Microsoft data centers are just a mile north from our facility. That's for 2028. And then with Nucor, we have an energy development agreement for 500 megawatts for early 2030s. Nucor is the largest producer of steel in the U.S. And so, to us, it's both the hyperscalers, the big users of compute, but also the industrial power base that are perfect customers for the solution that Helion can provide.
Sure, that makes sense. And, you talked a little bit about post-2028. What 2030s looks like for you demand-wise. What does post-2028 look like for the company overall? Do you stay private forever? Do you IPO? Do you raise Series G, F, H, so on and so forth?
2028 is first electrons in the grid.
Yes.
That's when fusion comes to life. And then post that, I mentioned Nucor, which is 2030. And then, the vision of the company remains a gigawatt a day of deployment. Of course, we're going to inch up to that in lockstep and, not baby steps. We'll take big strides and big leaps, but that remains the vision of the company by mid to late 30s is a gigawatt a day of deployment. And so up until then, we're going to invest in our supply chains. We're going to continue to invest in our manufacturing footprint. We're going to continue to lay the foundations to honor that vision that the founders have, when they started with the company.
And then maybe a public listing, if you have time for it.
Yeah, I think from a capital perspective, we're so grateful for the privilege that we have, the strong conviction that our investors continue to bless us with. And so, nothing more to share there, but we're in a fairly privileged position that it will be our decision when and if, is the right time to whether to make that decision or not.
Okay. I promised everyone in the room that I would ask about the sustainability of this AI boom. There's been a lot of talk about an AI infrastructure bubble. We made a graphic that has gone viral now with lots of circles
right.
to show the circularity of AI deals. Like, does that keep you up at night? How worried are you as somebody who is all in on the infrastructure that's supporting this boom?
So if you look at history and if you look at technological trends, my personal conviction is we're still in the very early innings of where AI is going to head. The analogy a lot of times I use is think of like the internet, the dial-up internet back in the mid-90s to now even post-COVID or during COVID, like where the internet went, that allowed us to continue to move forward from an economic standpoint. And so we're still in the very early innings. I think the key blockers for AI used to be chips and power. The joke I used to make to investors is like, what will not prevent us to fully leverage AI's success were Jensen's chips and energy. Chips are no longer the bottleneck today. There's a lot of competition, and NVIDIA continues to do really well when it comes to providing the world with its supply of GPUs. Energy remains the bottleneck, and that's what we are working towards, to provide that new source of power so that we unlock that bottleneck for AI to actually get to that ninth innings sooner rather than later. I believe we're still in the very early phases of the first innings when it comes to AI.
So if there is a bubble, you see it as being far, far out from where we are today.
Correct.
Okay. And, you have an interesting background that allows you to opine on sort of market conditions overall. Before this, you were at Waymo. And before that, you were in investment banking at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. I thought, personal question, what parallels do you draw between your experience both as an investment banker, but also at Waymo, and your experience thus far at Helion?
I'll start with my last company, Waymo. When I joined Waymo, we were at that commercial inflection point. The company was pivoting from R&D to commercial roadmap. I think when I joined Helion, we're exactly at that inflection point. Everyone has started talking about Waymos today. That was not the case a couple of years ago. Everyone will start talking about Helion and Fusion in the next couple of years. You're already starting to see the disruptive impact, the way that we think about travel. That's what Waymo is allowing that disruption to take place very soon as we think about where our energy is going to come. That's Fusion, that's Helion in the next couple of years.
Great. Well, I want to also get your thoughts, because of your Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley experience, on this recent AI fear trade. I mean, it just feels like, Anthropic particularly has become this boogeyman, like everybody fears what the next product they're going to release is, and which complex is going to tank on it. How do you make sense of it as somebody who was in, on the other side of that trade at one point?
I think it takes time for the market to absorb and fully understand the implications of AI, and that's what we're currently seeing today. But I think the pace of innovation, the pace of disruption, the rate of change, the velocity is so much higher than what we had known in the past. And so you'll see some movements across different verticals and adjacencies. But at the end of each time we've seen such disruption, GDP has always pushed up higher. People have always ended up having better outcomes than where they were before. And so to me, I think this is just interim noise.
Yeah.
But we're seeing, we're soon hopefully going to gain the massive benefits and outcomes of this change of disruption that's taking place.
Yeah. What do you think? I mean, there is a contradiction, isn't there, between everybody who is saying that the AI is a bubble.
Right.
And everyone who's saying AI is going to be so extremely disruptive that it's going to destroy entire industries. How do you make sense of those two seemingly contradictory, market reactions playing out at the same time? Or do you even try?
I mean, we're in Manhattan. I just took a cab from Central Park down here. But if you go back many decades, these streets were littered with horses. And so when, you had the cars first come up, people were talking about disruption, of how, the disruption would cause to different industries. We've seen that with Industrial Revolution. And we've seen that when internet came to fore. We're seeing that today with AI. To me, I think with each disruption, we have to adapt as a society. And I'm sure, we're going to prevail and do that again this time.
Well, we only have about a half a minute left, and so I'm just going to throw you a random projection question.
Sure.
Clean energy, zero emissions energy, I should put it, is still only a fraction of the global power mix. A growing fraction, though. If we're looking at 2050, what does the global power mix look like, percentage-wise?
If you heard the president at the State of the Union, he's been talking about hyperscalers finding their own power solutions. I think, to me, Fusion, Helion clean energy, being able to provide abundant, reliable baseload power is going to become a strategic imperative, especially for the Western world. And so to me, right, like it's no longer a question of like a nice to have, it's a must have. And so I see 2050 where like we have that clean, reliable, abundant energy available to all in an age of abundance, as opposed to, all the fears that we're currently sort of like.
So it'll make up like 90% then.
Maybe even higher.
Well, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time, Prag.
Great. Thanks so much, Lynn. Really appreciate it.